1, 2, can you hear me? If we could close those doors in the back, if that, you could help me with that, and I'll introduce our speaker, though I know a number of you have already heard him in one of the other venues for the last 24 hours. But those of you who haven't, our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Dominic Burbidge. He's the director of the Canterbury Institute in Oxford University, where he also founded the Berry Scholarship for leading American intellectuals to be fully funded for their studies at Oxford. He's also a permanent lecturer at Oxford University in politics. Now, that's three things. Any one of those three would be a great lifetime accomplishment, but he's done all three of them, and as you can see, he's still a young man. And what that should tell you is that he's competent. So you can listen to him with not your dukes down, but your defensives down. Just be open to what he has to say. Okay, thank you, Dominic.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to ask if we're okay for hearing. Wonderful. Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I feel you've worked me hard, but I hope I'm up for the challenge for this after-dinner lecture. I always say that America takes the best of all of the European cultures. You see it with the obsession with good food of the Italians that seems to have carried over to the United States. You see it with the English liberty that has traveled through. You see it with the French dedication to professional leisure, which seems to have crossed across to America. And tonight I'm seeing the spread of the German work ethic with this after-dinner lecture. So I'm really grateful to be here, to thank especially Tori for organizing everything. Also the help of the President's office, Sophia, and the other staff members. It's been a true joy to be with you. I'm going to start with from Romans 8:24. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. For natural law theory, we are committed to the sorts of universal precepts of justice that pertain to our human nature and dignity. So a natural law perspective says that there are things common to humanity, common to our nature, that mean justice involves us realizing these truths wherever we are. In this sense, natural law theory has been employed as a foundation for human rights across the globe, because it speaks to the core human dignity that we all share regardless of boundaries. This is a problem, though, for political theory, because in line with what are called realists within political theory, there's an understanding that the political is in fact necessarily circumstantial. It's necessarily limited. It's a domain of compromise, a domain of negotiation. And that means you can't ever bring ideals fully to bear, abstract universals, to understanding what is political conduct. It's a domain of prudence, it's a domain of practical wisdom, and you should somewhat leave your ideals at the door. So we have to ask, is it just that natural law theory is a sort of limited argument? Does it play a role in some sort of general ethical insights? Or can it also help us in the political domain? It seems, from what I've said so far, that it has no real place in politics. It might have some universal ethical appeal, and this could form a sort of very loose notion of justice and rights that are applicable everywhere. But as soon as you get into the weeds of what our community needs right now, what collective action is required for the moment to fill and provide for our needs, it is going to fall short in the level of prescription that is needed. Some even believe this from what can be termed a kind of positive law direction. So within legal theory, many people contrast a natural law perspective with those who are more positivistic about law. And what the legal positivists, loosely speaking, say is that law is just a product of what we stipulate as law. Law is what we come together and politically say should be the rules. And it could be anything. I could say all lectures must be delivered standing up, or I could say all lectures must be delivered sat down. This is the arbitrariness of law. It has no roots in universal ideas of justice. And some would go even further in the legal positivist camp and say that not only is law arbitrary with respect to the good, law as a positive legal code is also complete. You don't need anything else to explain what law is. Law is complete in the sense that law describes every action as either allowed or not allowed. Everything is covered. Everything is understandable according to the legal code. The law is also final. We get a complete, thorough determination of innocence or guilt. And if we have to wait around too much, we make our claim to be judged and to understand where we stand with respect to law. The legal system for a positivist can also be complete in the sense that it is run by a sovereign who has complete control over this. You may say, oh, this sounds a bit authoritarian. This sounds a bit European. But the command of a sovereign could mean anything. It could mean the Constitution as a sort of sovereign document, but it could also mean we the people, who when we come together form a sovereignty of final decision-making over the way our institutions are governed, what we count as a crime, and what is our right. So all of these aspects of the legal system give a picture of it as complete and authoritative. And we might compare that, for example, to manners. So you can think your idea of good manners should hold sway, but it's hard to imagine that that idea is authoritative and binding. Manners at home in the family is a point of dispute. What's the right way of going about things? And you might actually develop a quite consistent sort of set of manners. Like we might have the kind of rule or manner, informal understanding that we don't sort of check our phones at the dining table. We might say everyone should really make their bed in the morning. But all of these are going to be different in other families. And if you imagine two divorcees who marry and bring kids both together to a sort of new household, you're going to have this whole differences of sets of manners. And between those differences, you're not going to have a clear authority of whose must be followed versus all the others. It's a point of negotiation, a point of dispute. But with the law, we say that there really is an authority. There really is a final decision. And that follows perhaps a process of dispute. It could even involve an appeals process, but eventually you arrive at that sort of finality. So once again, it looks as though there isn't really a need for natural law theory to be able to govern a particular country. We can get the laws right. Those laws can be a complete system. I want to argue instead that not only is natural law foundational for how we understand authority within a political community, but it's also something that should be behind our political theory of the next steps that we take as a community. For this, the first step in the argument is to say that from the positive's point of view, even if law appears complete, it doesn't exhaust what we would call normativity, normative arrangements. The idea of the normative is pretty difficult within the way we use it in English. It's not a very common phrase. We don't have politicians saying, I'm going to be the most normative, vote for me. And part of the confusion is well placed, because alongside speaking to the question of values and good values, the normative also somewhat appeals to being normal. And in this country that loves independence so much, you might say, being good is not about being normal. I want to be extraordinary. But in fact, for the natural law tradition, these ideas are not so out of sync. Because when we talk of normality, we are also including in that talk of what pertains to our nature. So from an Aristotelian point of view, being good is a flourishing of our nature towards its goals that lie in its complete fulfillment, in its happiness. So in a way, it's normal to be happy in the sense of it's normal to our nature. We aim at happiness and we seek to arrive at it through everything that we're doing. So for the question of whether the law is complete, we have to admit that there's all kinds of other normativity out there. Part of it in our nature, part of it in the manners we have, or what Alexis de Tocqueville would talk about in terms of the mores, which is an even worse word to try and explain than normativity. But the mores within society that bind us together, these sometimes quoted as habits of the heart, that are our dispositions towards one another that aren't necessarily forced on us by an authority, but come in line with our culture and our common understandings, common knowledge of what is good for us. So in this sense, the central case of law for figures like John Finnis is the legal system of the complete community. So you notice here in his definition of the central case of law, he's discussing the community as complete, not the legal system. What's the difference? For the legal positivist, what matters is that your legal structure is tight, there aren't exceptions, there aren't inconsistencies, one law saying the opposite to another. There's a clear process, and that process is structured in a final authority. That's the completeness of the law. But for Finnis, in searching for the common good as a community, we're seeking a complete community, for which law forms a part and finds its best expression through, but is not exhausted in its normativity by what the law says. So our political nature, in fact, has to navigate lots of competing normativities as we together try to search for what is good. It's not the case that we can rely on the law to do that work for us. We're shifting, we're growing, we're aging, we're having newborns. The world around us is changing. Nature itself is a process of change and growth. And we're also coming to a more refined understanding, hopefully, of our needs and the depths of those needs and how we need to change ourselves to best meet and realize that for the sake of that common happiness. So in that quest, the normativity is a point of debate and exploration. Just as you might feel that over the course of your life, you find deeper reasons for things that you do, you might have deeper convictions that develop, or arguments or understandings about yourself and society that seem to take root. This is in a way no different to the political community, which you might say in a new country or a new town has a lot of unknowns. We're not sure where we are and who we are and what we need to do. But over time builds not only a sense of its place, but also the sense of itself through conversation over its values and how to realize those where it is. So this means that for understanding the flourishing of the political community, we have to see other areas of stable expression of our political nature. Of course, as you know, Aristotle describes us as having being by nature sort of political, or sometimes translated as by nature social. And this means that we find our fulfillment in part in our relationships. Politically speaking, it also means that for him, the polis is more self-sufficient than the individual because it's better placed to provide for the needs. What counts as our needs is something of an open question, but the end towards the flourishing of the political community keeps in mind the substantial ontology of each individual person and how much they will flourish in community with others. And this is important because a lot of people make the mistake that the formation of the political community is something that takes away the need to have concern for individual flourishing, in that the category of the polis is the best expression of how we flourish as a group, and necessarily how we flourish as individuals. An example of someone who holds that view is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's 18th century Genevan, born in Geneva in Switzerland, but then spent most of his life running around, being chased, but mostly within France, though in part in England, etc. So people often think he's French. And for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the formation of the state involves the volonté générale, the general will of the people. And when it's formed, it takes forward a kind of new being in its civic expression, such that we will all yield to what is best for the group as a whole. So it seems under Rousseau that the polis is sort of taking on a life of its own. But actually, for Aristotle, as is clear in his Metaphysics, the person has a substantial unity to them. And there are accidental features as to how we know and understand how the person relates to others. And types of ways we relate mean we form types of groups. And these are properly groups, they are properly interesting, they are communities, and they can even form a polis in their most sort of perfect manifestation. But they don't take away from what it means to be a person, nor that the happiness lies in that individual and in that flourishing. So for Aristotle, when his ideas are explored and interpreted by Aquinas, Aquinas will talk about political unity or the political community as being a sort of unity of order. And of course, being independence lovers, you say, no one should order me around. But even if you don't want others to order you as an authority, even your joining together with common projects is a type of order, a type of harmony. It has a sort of newfound level of being together. It doesn't take away who you are and the value of that, but nevertheless has its own dynamism and its own structure. This is the beauty of even a place like Benedictine College, where you will have that added as an asset to you. It doesn't take anything away, but it's still a newfound level of harmony. Actually, to get biographical on this, in case anyone wants a more personal anecdote, I did a painting 2 weeks ago, right? So I did paint. I see none of you have bought my paintings. That's okay. And so this painting was for friends of mine. The wife is Kenyan and the husband is Ghanaian. And I was with them in their wedding in Kenya. It's sort of the best man, which is a wild affair. And in the painting, which is 4 meters long, it has people moving, traveling together, some in groups, some on their own, walking past the cross. And the meaning of the painting is that everyone, before they walk past the cross, the colors of their sort of African dresses are red and yellow. As they move past the cross, they're red, yellow, and green. And the meaning is that Christianity doesn't take anything away from your culture. It only adds. It adds newfound levels of depth. So part of the attempt within that sort of painting hopefully meets with some of the understandings of figures like Aquinas, that as you enter into things like political community or into culture, these newfound levels of order add layers of harmony to you, and they don't take anything away. And they're in fact part of your flourishing, but the substantial unity, the beauty of your human dignity remains intact, such that a man without political community is not less of a man, but we still look to support them and be hospitable towards them, to include them, because we seek to best meet their needs and best see them flourish. But the dignity they have is regardless. So from the point of view of forming a stable idea of the polis, it would be a difficult temptation to say that the only way we find that concrete stability is by taking the group level as ontological over and above that individual level. Nevertheless, there are ways of being a good citizen or being a bad citizen. And so for understanding those other areas of stable habits of disposition, stable habits of conduct, the Aristotelian and Thomistic and natural law tradition usually makes generous use of concepts of virtue for saying that by habit you form being a kind of person that is at the disposition of others. But even there's nothing that's taken away from you. In this sense, like the burden is light. Because everything that you build in your dispositions of habits and goodness to others only makes you more of a man. It only makes you, in this sense, even more of a citizen. Which is why, even in natural law ideas about freedom of conscience, we can't actually say exercising freedom of conscience is being a bad citizen. Because, in fact, it's being the best citizen. Because most open to ideas of justice and being able to share that justice with others, being open to stand up for it for the sake even of the goodness of the group. So, all this you might agree with and say, that sounds okay. But it's not starting to sound like a political theory yet. And wouldn't it be dangerous to sort of, even though this sounds like a nice idea, enforce that idea on other people who don't agree? So it's right that we're very hesitant on this topic of political theory. In the main, I say this as a sort of political theorist, mostly we harm. Mostly we come up with bad ideas. And sometimes it manifests in terrible ways. Other times we get a lucky escape and no one listens to us. And so everything works out okay. So of course we need to go slowly, go carefully with political theory ideas. And any such ideas have to be understood within the context of political goods not being the highest manifestation of happiness. It's much better to flourish as an individual and as a community together than just any one of those. So a political theory shouldn't try to advance the flourishing of the community as a whole, as meaning you don't need to look at the question of being a good person deep down, a good person at the individual level. But all that having been said, I want to suggest that there are some basic truths that natural law theory should or can contribute to forming a political theory. First is that natural law theory says, so these are three I'm going to list. First, natural law says that we can't be essentialist in treating different races or location as unequal with respect to their human dignity. That has to be a foundational point of any political theory that is derived from natural law. The second is that we cannot make any assumptions that are reductive of the human person. By this, it's important to compare with other examples of political theory. Some people attribute to Thomas Hobbes the starting of the social sciences. Why? There are clearly political thinkers, from even before Plato. There are social thinkers, social theories before then. The reason why people sometimes make this attribution is that Hobbes brought in Newtonian understandings to atomize the notion of the individual such that they are a product of simple sort of cause and effect. So in this sense, Hobbes is a social scientist of trying to make a science out of social affairs, one that conforms to perhaps a sort of caricature of the pure sciences where there is physical determination in cause and effect. And this is why Hobbes is sort of portrayed as an individualist, but even probably more accurate than that is to say he has an atomistic view of the human person. And so we have, of course, for Hobbes, appetites and passions, but these are like base instincts that you can make predictions of because we will always be following those. And political society has to be understood as negotiating those sort of animalistic, kind of bestial instincts. That's an example, and others abound. The same framework operates in Marxism, because Marxism also makes strong assumptions about seeking the benefits direct to one's class, which is a sort of movement towards what will satisfy those spread with complicated ideas of class system and spread in a narrative of different stages of history for which classes may change and the relationship among those classes may change. But insofar as the solution to human strife lies in the elimination of private property, there is a general sense within Marxism that the motivation of greed is the best way of reducing notions of human agency to predict political affairs. So it's clear that from within natural law theory and also in general an Aristotelian approach, that the human being has to be understood as somewhat of a complicated, multi-layered being. We don't need to settle right now how the human person metaphysically is structured, but taking, easy examples of saying that we're part reason, part appetite, part passion is enough to say, oh, it's complicated, what's going on? And to reduce it to any one for the sake of saying it would be quick and easy to arrive at a utopia that eliminates the need for human virtue is problematic on the natural law account. The third is that we have to abandon narratives of politics as being only about the ascendancy of power. This is a kind of view that's grown up in tandem with Michel Foucault, who is like a philosopher who deals with so many topics and a social theorist that it inevitably enters discussion of political theory too. But for Foucault, the best way of understanding human relations is understanding the relationship of power among all of them. So every exercise of agency is a form of attempted or realized domination of others. So for Foucault, there can't be a genuine civic togetherness, a genuine unity of order, because the ways in which we act are to pursue our own objectives, even when we are in the knowledge game, even when you think you're just describing information or learning about things or ordering a library. Any form of ordering or communication is a way of engaging in an agenda setting over others. So these three need to be chucked out if we're to do a sort of natural law-inspired political theory. And the answer is instead to root things within ideas of the common good. Now that's not to say, there's a fairly recent book now by Adrian Vermeule, who's a law professor in Harvard, which is called Common Good Constitutionalism. Yeah, I invited him for a reading group and I said sit in this chair and the chair collapsed underneath him. Yeah, that has never happened to me before, ever in my life. But like the one time I have a Harvard professor, I invite him to a chair that collapses. And he thought it was some kind of fraternity joke or something like that. Yeah, so, yeah, things didn't go well. So in his book on common good constitutionalism, he is arguing that you can derive very clear views of the common good to prescribe all of what sort of just laws should be. That's not quite the sense in which I'm using the phrase common good, although there's some overlap in terms of the common good being a guiding light and the realization of the political community. And the reason of the difference speaks to the direction I think we should go sort of going forward, which is to say that natural law theory hitherto has expressed universalisms, including ideas of like prudence within that, but as a sort of general abstract theory. And these are sort of stable principles and precepts. And on the other hand, you have the sort of revolutionary political theory that says, you know, turn up everything, throw it away. The human nature you're talking about is actually malleable, and we can find ways of repurposing it towards a more sort of utopian vision. But there is an in-between stance in that debate, and it's to say this, that even from an Aristotelian point of view, the nature of something is also inclusive of how it grows. To be alive is always involving some kind of growth. And so even when we are drawing stable principles of something's nature, it has a way in which we also need to understand its growth. And in some things, that's like a pretty radical change, like a caterpillar into a butterfly. And in other times, it's very small, and it's hard for us to notice. But the beauty of being is intertwined, is inextricable from the beauty of how things grow. And this is evident in a political community which is an ever-growing thing, and our culture ever-growing, and new people enter in, and the old sadly pass away. All the time we're yearning for a level of growth. Could be a growth in who we are. It could be a growth in a collective wisdom. Could be a growth in the understanding of the beauty of human dignity. All of these are areas of growth, however light and incremental and non-revolutionary. They form a key part of what a political community is. What is the virtue that best expresses growth? Is the virtue of hope. Being a theological virtue, it's natural that it didn't feature that much for Aristotle, but it's why I started this lecture with this quote, that hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. It's so strange that the word patient would be there. Wouldn't it be more virtuous to demand it, to be urgent about it? Maybe this speaks also, to a lesser degree, less important than questions of salvation. Doesn't it speak also to the way in which the best politics has a certain patience to it with our fellow citizens, those around us? Thank you so much for listening.
If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic so everybody can hear your question. Don't be bashful. Kevin, okay. And tell everybody who you are, though everybody knows who you are, Kevin, but tell them anyway.
Kevin Vance. I'm the director of the Center for Constitutional Liberty. I wanted to see if you could say a little bit more about, and I saw that you had published an article on this, but if you could say a little bit more about the difference between your understanding of the common good and the way that Vermeule uses it.
Yeah.
Like just how determined, are you saying that he's way more determinative than you are about what the contents of that entail or something? Anyway, just curious about what you have in mind there exactly.
Thanks very much. It's a really great question. I am very grateful to it as well, because I think it does help try to better explain some of the things I was attempting in this lecture. So Aquinas' definition of law of rationis ordinatio ad bonum commune promulgata. So in that definition of law, you have this this ad bonum commune, which is to common good. Let me just first translate law is an ordinance of reason to the common good that is promulgated by he who has care of the community. So law itself for Aquinas is rational and a way of ordering, but it's best understood as for the purposes of realizing the common good. Now, for Vermeulen, he is worried, as you all know very well already, but just for the sake of giving the full picture, he is worried about perhaps the originalists in the US going a bit too far, in that although, of course, we need honesty, and part of honesty is staying kind of faithful to the text of something, and even sort of the intentions and ideas around the founding. At the same time, it seems a bit strange from a justice point of view to insist on being ever bent on being accurate in reading if it doesn't realize itself in what we would understand from a natural law point of view as like the full justice of a well-lived life, a well-lived political community. So he believes that you should make recourse to notions of the common good to enliven and improve the interpretation of law among judges. And of course, he had major pushback from loads of people from every end of the spectrum, which is never a good sign, because you have some people who say, well, that takes away the sort of the point of democracy of changing laws with a particular purpose. But it also feels that it could be kind of used to override the laws with just your interpretation of the common good. So my criticism on this front is that I feel he made a mistake in the Latin, because ad bonum commune is not, there's nowhere within that where you necessarily have the definite article when you translate it. So it's true that we're talking about the singular, because bonum is the singular versus bona, which is like plural. But you can be singular, but indefinite article, like a common good. And so with Aquinas, it might be better to interpret his notion of the common good involving pluralities of common goods, which we might easily describe in terms of there are many shared goods that bring together the perfection of a political community. So the mistake is that when taking the English translation, he's read too much into into a placement of the definite article. But in fact, if Aquinas really intended that, there are other, although there aren't articles in Latin, there are other mechanisms like illam to be able to really put stress on it being singular and exclusively so. So I put this to Vermeulen in person before that was published, and he agreed with me. So it doesn't destroy his argument. Yeah, both. Yeah. He's a nice guy, despite the whole chair thing. The chair thing was actually a few years ago. Yeah. So I think he didn't remember as the same guy. Yeah. It didn't for him like destroy his argument, because he's okay with quite an open idea of what the common good is, and he feels maybe other people put too much stress on the idea that it's like a singular notion of what is the common good for America. And in fact, this is somewhat vindicated in the way he feels that in law you might be able to interchange notions of common good with public benefit or public good, which is a whole different hazardous kind of debate. But you can see where he's coming at it from, that he was sort of, he felt a bit relaxed about my point. But it's important for me in this argument because it leaves open the possibility that the common good for the political community is not something fixed you either like have or don't have, but can also be a process of discovery, and in that sense is described also with ideas of the growth of the thing as part of its nature.
Hi, thank you for your talk, Professor. I was actually just reading Joseph Pieper's book on hope before this talk, and he says that the virtue of hope implies that we are on the way, that we are like not yet going to like find this fulfillment on earth, and so that the opposites of hope are like either despair or presumption that like we could achieve perfect fulfillment on earth, or that we couldn't ever fulfill that. So would you say it's necessary in order to avoid such a despair that I've noticed a lot in politics today? Would you say that it's necessary to have the Christian virtue of hope, or is there a way to like live this hope in politics without necessitating it to be a Christian virtue?
Yeah.
I'm Sarah.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much, Sarah. It's a really wonderful question. I think post-Reformation, there is more of a tension placed within Christian theology over whether hope in the world, in earth, is whether that's zero-sum with hope in the afterlife, especially for figures like Calvin, and the way in which we sort of interpret the value of work. So whether work is just a kind of, it could be an indicator of one's righteousness, but it's not something which you should kind of hope in the sense that no matter how much good work you do, salvation is given by the grace of God and pertains to the next life. Now, this is quite different from like earlier sort of monastic ideas of like cultivation, gardening, work as a sort of expression of the beauty of creation. So I was in a Cistercian monastery in southern France, and I was like doing a tour of it with some of the Canterbury students, and there was a monk with us. So we happened to be visiting a monastery as if we're tourists, but we had in our group a monk. He still had to pay entry, yeah. And so he from a different order, but one of the things he noticed doing the tour, which I had no way of noticing or thinking of this, is that he's called Brother Matthew Warners. So inside the monastery, everything was just with this white stone. It was almost like being in a black and white movie. You just got white shades of gray and black, and I think they wear white as well. So you could say it's like thoroughly boring. You know, what is this? You know, is this really going to inspire you about God? This is a pre-Reformation monastery. But what he felt when he was there is like, for these monks, the beauty of their garden and the surrounding farmlands that they're working in must have been like this sort of rush of color that is breaking in constantly. So in some ways, when you deprive yourself of something, you're building up an even greater hunger for it. And the place of the earth and its failings, from one point of view, people worry that makes some think there is no God because such suffering. But a true understanding of it is is to start to enter into the depth with which it calls you to a bigger hope. That all of the lack of color has this corresponding breakthrough of color and light. So as it pertains to the more banal question of like a political community, every journey of hope for each person is at a particular step. And to be better at something, we have to practice it. But that's not to say the thing we're practicing it on is the exhaustive purpose of it. So I might sort of attend classes with my wife about how to bring up kids, you know, and we might be like expecting kids and we don't yet have kids. Now, I'm not trying to do these well to be a guy who's good at taking classes about being a father. I'm doing this to be a good father. And that's the shift in thinking that comes when the reason for bringing about hope in others, even if it seems short-term and they can't see the full purpose, in God's eyes, every growth of habit in this, even on material things and building hope in a community, prepares them and speaks for the ultimate story of hope.
Okay, this will be the last question. I'm exercising the virtue of mercy. He's been at it for 8 hours, so this will be our last question.
So in a culture that lacks hope and lacks meaning and often has a knee-jerk negative reaction to bringing up natural law, how do we communicate the good of the natural law in giving people meaning? I guess I'm looking for something a little more practical and down to earth in communicating than just saying, oh, we need to appeal to natural law.
Yeah, thanks. So here's one like very practical suggestion which a lot of people will be nervous about. So a practical suggestion for like advocating value of natural law approach is to say you're not the best interpreter of yourself. This is controversial, even in Christian circles at times, because sometimes we think that when we say we engage in questions of personal flourishing, the personal definitely it seems for some people to mean it's sort of self-propelling, that it's sort of my personhood, which is really who I think I am. And of course, we're in that space of debate because we don't want to say the thing that is associated with, just very shallow caricatures of natural law, which is to say it's like biological determinism. So to sort of say, oh yeah, you are by nature this one thing, so be that, like you are a hunter. I went shooting and the guy's like, yeah, because by nature we are hunters. I just shot clay, so I guess I'm still not a man. But in a way, there are people who have a certain appeal to like get me back to my biological fundamentals. But from the point of view of Thomistic metaphysics, we're pursuing and developing the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. It would be a major injustice to try to pretend we are not the fullness of the gifts of reason that we've been given as a fundamental part of our nature. So it means we inevitably, in the natural law debates, go towards saying, well, you are everything about your experience. But it's also true that the life well lived is something that depends on the advice of others and the accrued wisdom of what makes sort of good habits for a life well lived. And in that sense, it's very hard to think on what grounds you could sustain the position that you are the best interpreter of the best way you should express yourself and live your life. You need the advice of others, and you need people who also know human nature well. And in that sense, advice is not just someone who knows you well, it's also from a wise person. Wise people will see the tendencies of human nature. They will know the ways in which one pattern of thinking leads to another. And so this is really, I think, a helpful way to try to communicate a natural law and virtue understanding of what people should practically be doing to better their lives. But it does require humility, because the rest of culture, Western culture right now, is affirming your view as the right view, because that's the view that makes the market money, because they need impulsive buying. But to get advice means to calm down on that and have self-reflection, which slows down, the market, and it also starts to distinguish needs from wants. So the pressure is against us, but it's a nice point to finish on, which is that in communities like this, you actually see it happen. So the fight is not over.